Happy 4th of July. There is a non-zero possibility that we may all be doomed. But when you really think about it, is that so different from every other day? Except that on this day, I get to wear red, white, and blue and probably eat a cheeseburger later. So, all things considered, pretty good day. Now, this is not a politics podcast. Never has been, never will be. This is not a podcast where I tell you what you should believe politically, or I tell you what I believe politically. I think the Western canon is for everybody, and I know that I have listeners from a variety of political perspectives. If you want to know what I think on politics, who I'm voting for, all that stuff, you can find it very easily online. There's plenty of places for me to talk with you about that, for you to read what I write on Twitter or various websites and blogs and magazines. You can find that stuff out there. That's not what this show is about, because there's enough political chatter going on in our lives. We all, I think, are hypersaturated with various people's opinions, including our own, about politics. So I'm not here to tell you that the Western canon absolutely dictates that you must vote for this or that person because Dostoevsky would want you to be a Republican, or Thomas Aquinas would want you to be a Democrat, or whatever else. I'm definitely not trying to do that, and I don't think that's the best use of our time, because, as I say, these treasures of the literary canon, of the artistic canon, of the philosophical canon, they're not just there for a particular political elite. They do contain political ideas, and we all have to wrestle and grapple with them, but they're bigger. The tradition is bigger than any one particular ideology, no matter how good that ideology is, no matter how much you believe in that ideology. The world is always larger than your philosophical system, and that's why it always pays to wrestle with the world as seen through eyes that are not your own. The clearest and most beautiful visions of the world that we have been able to record, set down on paper, are within these archives, and so part of engaging with them is seeing the world not necessarily through your particular political lens or even any political lens, but from a whole different set of perspectives. That's a major part of what I'm trying to offer here, what I want you to get out of this. And so it would be, I think, a failure on my part. I would not be doing my job if I were simply preaching at you about politics. That's why this is not a politics podcast. But this is a podcast about reality. It's about the world in all its complexity, all its challenges, and in the mess that we're facing right now, how we can reach back into some of the glories of the past, some of the best insights that were drawn out of other messes. Because remember, it's always a mess. It's never simple. The present is always full of difficulty, challenges, uncertainty. The past can sometimes look more pristine, even though it never really was for those living through it, because we've siphoned off some of the best insight that comes from the people who lived through prior generations. And that's a good thing, but we shouldn't trick ourselves into believing that, therefore, we are facing something of greater terror and horror and catastrophe than any other generation has ever faced. That's not how that works. It might be that we're living through a period of particular turmoil. I think that we are, but it's not as if nobody has ever faced any of these challenges before, which is good news because it means we're not alone. Politics is part of the mess that we are up against. In fact, in some sense, it might just be defined as the messy business of structuring human life, which is always and ever on the precipice of disaster. And so we don't have to ignore politics or refuse to talk about politics. And this year, it's going to loom really large for a lot of us because it's an election year. It's been, for really many years now, a very difficult time in American politics, a very fraught time. Those of us, and I include myself, who really passionately believe in the concept of America, that is, the founding documents, the arguments that were made in favor of our Constitution, our larger way of life that emerged out of the kind of Anglo-American adventure into this new world. Those of us who believe in that are full of doubts right now, I think, and concerned about the future. that much, I think, has been clear for some time. Now it's an election year after probably the most contentious election in my lifetime. The 2020 election was probably the most high octane and difficult and fractious and angry election that I've ever lived through, and that's saying something. It included, remember COVID and the riots of 2020 and the January 6th stuff, and everything was bound up in that. We're about to go through that again. We've all got a little bit of PTSD, besides which the candidates on the table are a lot to take. No matter what side you're coming from, each one of them brings with him a whole host of questions and issues about the state of American politics. And so we're probably all thinking about that on this July 4th, and it would be crazy for me not to talk about it when I'm doing a July 4th episode. It would be crazy for me not to try and see if I can put this moment into some degree of context, or at least offer you a nugget to take with you as you go forth into your July 4th holiday, so that you maybe feel a little bit less alone, a little bit less filled with despair. Because we all just watched this debate, right? Or if you didn't watch it, you've probably heard about it. Nobody thought it was going to happen. I didn't think it was going to happen. But in fact, they did meet, these two candidates. Donald Trump, recently convicted of a felony, 34 counts of felony. And, you know, I question whether those counts were really each individual. There's basically one thing that they got him on, one charge that they managed to convict him on. And then Joe Biden, who in the lead up to the debate was looking increasingly disoriented. I mean, again, without grinding a political axe here, one reason why people thought that this was not going to happen is because Biden has clearly been suffering from some kind of decline, probably to do with dementia. He's a very elderly man, and those of us that have lived with friends, family, whatever, that have dementia or have succumbed to dementia can recognize this feeling and have a certain degree of empathy for this feeling of disorientation, the trailing off into space, the not really knowing where you are or what you're saying. And no matter how many of those clips may have been selectively edited to emphasize how bad things are, there's really no version of an edit that could erase what was going on. So we've got these two people, one of them a major hate object, the other one clearly a last-ditch effort in some way on the part of the Democrats to perhaps hold their coalition together, perhaps simply to present an alternative to Trump, whatever. And in fact, in the moment, it turned out that Biden really did sort of liquefy on stage. We had a to me, astounding. It was one of those experiences I couldn't really believe that I was watching it. And I had kind of a double experience of it. Let me try to explain what I mean by this. When I watched this debate, there was part of me that had already accepted all the stuff that I just said, that already knows where we're at as a country, that understands basically how we got here and the forces of partisanship that have ended us up with Joe Biden in the White House and Donald Trump challenging him again. And when you take all that for granted and you just watch this debate, there is a very clear winner. I mean, Biden, especially near the beginning, but just in general, kind of was unraveling into these incoherent answers. Many commentators on the left who were watching also had to sort of concede this. There's now much more serious talk of replacing him, although I don't think that's really logistically even possible, or if it is possible, it's going to cause just as much chaos as keeping him. So there's sort of now no non-disastrous, bizarre option for the Democrats. Trump, meanwhile, was as personally restrained as I have ever seen him. He made one perfectly placed comment about how he couldn't understand what Joe Biden was saying. And for Trump, especially given his, I think, rather poor debate performances last time around, in which he was overly aggressive and came across kind of too cruel and in some ways unhinged or out of control, here he had clearly been coached or learned from his past experiences and was just quite precise for him. And so in that context, when you know these guys already and you know sort of the range of things to expect, it was plain that Biden lost and Trump won. And that's kind of one layer of the experience. I would call that the inner layer, right? When you're inside the experience, you already know what's going on. Then there was this secondary meta experience where you pull back the camera and you think, imagine that you haven't already accepted all of these, contextual facts, this whole scenario. And you're an alien coming down to America for the first time, and you sort of understand the history of the country, and you know that this is a constitutional republic, at least ostensibly. And then suddenly someone just puts this debate in front of your eyes. At that point, and if you look at the debate that way, I found the whole thing kind of heartbreaking. And I find it heartbreaking that we've placed this clearly unwell man in charge of, if not the most powerful country in the world, although I think still probably the most powerful country in the world, then the country that I love most and that I want to see succeed, and that certainly can do a lot of damage if mismanaged. And I believe that the Biden presidency has already been pretty disastrous, but it could be a lot more disastrous. And so that is heartbreaking, but also heartbreaking that this debate, which is a discussion of serious challenges that we face, not just our major immigration problem, but the fact that the administrative state has spun wildly out of control for decades, our debt, which nobody really seems to want to talk about. I mean, Trump too has sort of been reticent or hesitant to talk about reforming entitlements, and that all of these issues are being faced by these two 80-year-old third graders. I mean, those are both exaggerations to some extent. I think Trump isn't quite 80 yet, but these are these aging men, one of whom is truly off the cliff and over the hill and all those other topographical metaphors, and one of whom seems, to my mind, from my perspective, to have sort of a firmer, clearer grasp on the situation. But nevertheless, this is not Abraham Lincoln, and you don't need me to tell you that, right? Even if you support Trump, even if you like him, it strikes me as sad that this is kind of what we've ended up with, and that by the end of this, you've got these two guys bickering over their golf games. And so in a larger context, I have to feel that we are sort of grinding out the last exhausted stages of a political debate that has kind of been raging since the Cold War, and that now it doesn't work, but we don't know what else to replace it with. And we're a little bit scared of what's going to come after it. Because on the Democrat side, you've got these young, very radical people who seem to have really taken seriously the sort of new left, you might call it cultural Marxist, understanding of the world as divided into oppressor and oppressed, good and evil, and have placed, for example, Israel on the side of the oppressor, which I just think is plainly wrong, and above that, flirting with all sorts of truly nasty evils. On the right, I think we're a little bit afraid of what it would take to really resolve the problems that we're facing, which are so acute. And so instead of trying to cobble together something that will work, it feels to me a little bit like we are just gnawing away at this one old wound, because it's safer in some sense than facing up to the genuine challenges and the compromise it will take and the aggressiveness it will take in certain sectors of government. And so, without getting into like my preferred program for the country, I just think that nobody really thinks that this is it. Nobody thinks that this is going to be the solution. And it feels in some sense like decline, which is a terrible feeling. It feels like the end of something. It feels like kind of the wind going out of the sails, the trumpet like losing its pitch and going womp, womp, and just a general sense of deflation I felt when I looked at this thing from the outside as a whole, and kind of got this weird, like the theater critics might call it an alienation effect, where I was like, oh my gosh, if I hadn't already been so deep in this process and we're coming at it for the first time, I think I would feel a real loss and a real sorrow. And it's important when we're at this holiday that's supposed to be celebrating and supposed to be pumping our fists for America to, I think, acknowledge, at least on my part, that sorrow. And I was thinking about how to grapple with this, and it occurred to me that this is actually not just about us. It's not all about us, okay? Because interestingly, on this particular July 4th, there's also an election going on in England on July 4th, on Independence Day. Can you believe the nerve of these Brits? They're holding an election on what's supposed to be our day, okay? This was supposed to be our independence. Oh, wait, right, okay. I guess I can see why the Brits maybe not so keen to be deferent toward July 4th and Independence Day. But however you slice it, for whatever reason, they've ended up holding an election on July 4th. They can call their elections kind of whenever they want. There's obviously within limits and there are rules around it, but they don't have that regularized schedule that we have. And this election is kind of overdue, as I understand it. I was actually in England, in the UK, when Rishi Sunak, the current prime minister, announced that he would be calling an election. And I'd been in Scotland for my whiskey tasting diploma. And while I was there, they sort of decided they were going to have this July 4th election. And it was interesting to me because it felt a little bit like a mirror image of what's going on in America. So I say mirror because I think this British election, you may know more by the time you listen to this, but I think this British election is kind of going to go the other direction from our election. I'm not really here to make political predictions for you, but I do get the sense that all things being equal, Trump is kind of the favorite over here, so we're kind of moving in this rightward direction. I think that England, the UK, is going to move in a leftward direction because they've had this conservative government. Rishi Sunak is a Tory, it's called, a member of the Conservative Party, and they've been in power for a while. And there was a moment, kind of once Brexit was really set in place and Boris Johnson was prime minister, when it seemed as if England was like really going to get based all of a sudden, right? It kind of looked like, oh, wow, the Conservatives are really taking the reins in England, and it's a confident, muscular conservative approach. It's not simply a toothless, opposition party. This is like they're in power and they're really going to get some stuff done. And then, a lot like Trump, and Boris Johnson is the British figure that most reminds people of Trump, he got totally blindsided by COVID, and the whole thing seems to have unraveled and kind of fallen apart. And so they too kind of got this conservative government that was then deflated. And ever since there was a range of scandals surrounding Boris when it came to COVID and the restrictions that his government imposed but didn't follow and yada yada. Ever since then, you've had this very limp and demoralized conservative party. You had Liz Truss, who was right before Rishi Sunak, and that was genuinely an embarrassment. And now you've got Rishi, who is here announcing this election like out in the rain. It was quite a spectacle. It looked very glum and kind of dreary, this announcement of the election. And it feels like an election that is definitely going to cede power to the Labour Party, which is the other party really in their system, although, unlike us, they have a parliamentary system. And a parliamentary system means that you actually can have meaningful third, fourth, fifth parties, because even though you have to form a coalition government and, one party has to be kind of the senior partner, and usually the prime minister is a member of that party, you can nevertheless get people with seats in parliament make a meaningful difference. And so they do have this kind of populist party, which is Nigel Farage's party, called Reform, who may make out pretty well here. And that would be part of this larger trend that's going on in Europe that seems to represent sort of a surge in right-wing populist sentiment. And by that, I basically mean a vigorous response to the immigration crisis, which is much more severe, if you can believe it, over there in Europe than it is here. And on the continent, not in England, but on the continent during the most recent EU elections, there were all these big reform-style parties that have this same kind of Faragean attitude, very, at least rhetorically vigorous populist idea about how to restrict certain benefits just to citizens and to, really take a strong hand against immigration. You had them in Germany, in Italy, in France. I mean, Marine Le Pen, when I was growing up, was like this bogeyman for all my lefty friends. But her party, Rassemblement National, has really done well in these EU elections. So has Alternative für Deutschland, which is the German version, and Fratelli d'Italia, which is the Italian version. And so you've got this, at least, appearance of a populist uprising on the continent, which may or may not be able to effect real change in the system, which some people think is kind of set up to neutralize these sorts of genuinely democratic uprisings or what have you. But leaving that aside for a second, this English election is taking place still more demoralizingly in the context of a general rightward turn that seems to have passed England by, that seems to have hit those British shores early with Brexit, and now to have been basically contained or neutralized or diffused or whatever. And this, for some people, looks like a vision of Europe's future, that if the populist movement couldn't really find its footing in England, then maybe it will, as it often does in Europe, sort of surge up and then fizzle out. And this is kind of the context within which this election feels demoralizing to people on the right in England. And meanwhile, on the left, you've got the Labour Party and Keir Starmer. And I have to say that this too, not just because I am more conservative, but because of my general kind of meta vision that I'm talking about here, where you pull back the camera, right, and you look at the whole scenario and just think, what if I hadn't gotten into these weeds and accepted the premise to begin with? Then when you pull back and you look at all of this, you're like, really? Labor? Like, this is basically socialism, and socialism is so dead. You know, isn't labor the people that keep having to, like, kick people out of their party because of anti-Semitism, and during this war that's going on where Israel's kind of fighting for its life, and there's so much serious stuff going on, again, in Europe, to do not just with immigration, but with war, right? With militarization, and whether they're going to have to, arm up, and whether they should be investing more in energy while all these people are clamoring that they should basically like break down all of their power plants and go back to the Stone Age, right? So there, when you zoom back from all of this, it's like similarly to our situation, okay, maybe we're going to change hands from one party to another, and maybe I have feelings about that one way or another. Maybe I'm like, generally pro-Trump and generally anti-Starmer, but even just surveying the whole suite of options, it feels again like this sense of decline. It feels like deflation, feels like nobody has any new ideas, feels like nobody is willing to look seriously at what the people are saying about their current situation, about the economic disenfranchisement, about this genuine and kind of now really over-the-top immigration crisis in both countries. And it's like, you just look at all of that and you think, is this the best we can do on either side of this, of the Atlantic, right? Both here and across the pond. On July 4th, as they're having their election, I have to ask myself, and I think a lot of people are kind of asking themselves, no matter what their pre-existing political commitments, like, what else is there? Isn't there something else that we should be doing with our time? And this is not a great way to feel. And I just wanted to sort of start from that context, because I think it's fair, whatever political angle you're coming from, to say that the options on the table are not great and the problems facing us are serious and intense. And that combination is just a very daunting combination. And all of this whole kind of UK-America, Anglo-American crisis that I'm looking at, put me in mind, weirdly, not of the fall of the Roman Republic, which I've talked about before on this show, and which I do think is a good comparison case for our situation in a number of ways. But you can go back and listen to those episodes if you want. It didn't put me in mind this time of that. It put me in mind of one of the most obscure poems by a very famous poet named Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I think I've talked about Tennyson. We've never done a Tennyson episode before on this show specifically, but Tennyson's one of my favorite English poets, this 19th century Brit who, in some ways, is the quintessential English poet. His verses are incredibly mellifluous. They can be classicizing. They can also be really deeply invested in medieval literature. They're almost like troubadour poetry, reinvigorated and invented for the industrial age. And in this regard, he was a big inspiration for the Pre-Raphaelites and that whole movement that went on. And there's one reason, I guess, why I'm drawn to him, because I've been talking on the show lately about how I think we really do need a recovery of medieval ideas, not just the valor, the chivalric valor of the knights, but even more deeply, this sense of the world as aflame with symbols, as the world of the flesh is kind of this physical embodiment of some spiritual reality, and that the whole world is in some sense symbolic. You get this very felt idea, this very felt sense of that in medieval literature, and I think the people like Novalis, whom we talked about, like Tennyson, like the Pre-Raphaelites, who want to sort of excavate that, have the right idea. Plus, his poetry is gorgeous. If you've never read any Tennyson, I think he's one of the easier poets to get to know, because unlike, for example, Milton or Shakespeare, he doesn't really have a reputation for being syntactically difficult to untangle. And when I did our episode on Thomas Wyatt and how to read poetry, I pointed out that some of the challenge is really just, straightening out these complicated sentences, and sometimes you have to remember that this is just, even though at a larger syntactic unit, these poems can feel very complicated, word by word, you'll actually find that they're quite clear, and in some sense, they're designed to be as lucid as possible. Tennyson, you don't even really have to do as much work, I don't think, to untangle him, because he is known as the poet of mellifluous sounds. He just has this beautiful kind of euphony in his verse, and so there's an inherent aesthetic attraction to the way that he writes and the stuff that he does. My favorite poem of his is a poem called Ulysses, and it's about Odysseus looking back on his glory days as an old man and deciding to take one last voyage. And there are just some passages in there that are so lovely that you have to know what they mean. Life piled on life were all too little and of one to me. Little remains, but every hour is saved from that eternal sunset. Something more, a bringer of new things and violet were, for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought. I mean, it rolls off the tongue. I'm quoting from memory here, so forgive me if I get some stuff wrong, but go read the whole poem. It's lengthy, but not huge. That's Tennyson, right? And so when you say that Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote the best 4th of July poem I know, it's kind of a record scratch. Like, what? You're probably wondering how I got in this situation. It's that sort of thing. Because he's not the guy that you would think would be super gung-ho about America, especially given what I was just alluding to, that our American Independence Day is, somewhat awkwardly, a day of victory over England. Among other things, there was a war, you may have heard of it, between the troops of the colonists and the rebels on George Washington and the troops of King George, and we won. Hell yeah. July 4th, America, right? So to think of this as a holiday that a British person and a person of real investment in Britishness like Tennyson, that he could celebrate is sort of interesting. And of course, there is this now special relationship between the two countries, that we've gained this respect for one another. But Tennyson's writing in the 1870s, and it's not totally clear that a Brit should feel confident and excited about America. We haven't had the world wars yet. We haven't had the rise of the truly American century. And so what's going on here? Well, it actually turns out that for all his love of merry old England, Alfred Lord Tennyson had a real interest in, an attachment to America. And it kind of shifted and changed throughout his life. The poem that I'm going to read to you, which is called England and America in 1782 being the year that the peace was sort of brokered in the War of Independence, that the war was effectively won by the Americans. He wrote this poem in 1872, so almost 100 years after the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and all of that. And he was commissioned to write it by the New York Ledger. And he's looking back on this moment, effectively, of rebellion. And at this point, you might have noticed, if we're in 1872, one of the major things that happened is the Civil War. And by the time the Civil War was concluded, Tennyson was, I would say, a qualified Americophile. He loved America. He had this sort of attachment that people sometimes get down on him for, this attachment to the Southern agrarian mythos. But for my money, if you ask me as a reader of Tennyson, I don't think that was an attachment to slavery at all. There was this kind of mythos of the slave South that really idolized it as the last redoubt of medieval chivalry. And there's obvious reasons why a guy like Tennyson would have been interested in the possibility of a virgin territory, a fresh world where the old knightly spirit could live again. And this is like kind of Gone with the Wind type stuff, right? So Tennyson was interested in this, but not, I don't think, because of slavery, and certainly not as like an investment in the slave South. Like he thought, oh yeah, we really need to continue slavery in the South. It was more that he had this idea of America more generally. And this comes through in his poetry, which is not agrarian or Southern or anything like that, that he had this idea of the New World as a potentially blank slate for the spirit of England to breathe forth into, and all that was great about his nation to grow and live in this new and fresh way. And this is something that Edmund Burke kind of hinted at when he was defending the revolution while it was happening, the American Revolution. Burke was a great defender of this, and I think that Tennyson picks up some of that same idea. He's also a little bit worried that maybe America is going to get so big and so powerful, especially as a maritime power, that it might challenge England's empire. And so he's grappling with all of these things, as you naturally would as an Englishman that supports Britain's control of the seas and all of that. And so, to me, all of that complexity makes it more poignant and more rich and hard-earned that in this poem for the New York Ledger, Tennyson writes what I think must be the manliest and noblest assessment of what the American Revolution means for Britain and for the world more generally, and for the West as a whole. And I'm just going to read it to you because it's really short. You could consider this my July 4th toast to you. England and America in 1782 by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Here we go. O thou, he's addressing Britain here. O thou that sendest out the man to rule by land and sea, strong mother of a lion line, be proud of those strong sons of thine who wrenched their rights from thee. What wonder if, in noble heat, those men thine arms withstood, retaught the lesson thou hadst taught, and in thy spirit with thee fought, who sprang from English blood. But thou rejoice with liberal joy, lift up thy rocky face, and shatter when the storms are black, in many a streaming torrent back, the seas that shock thy base. Whatever harmonies of law the growing world assume, thy work is thine, the single note from that deep chord which Hampden smote will vibrate to the doom. I'm going to get back to that Hampden reference in a bit and explain it, but the beautiful sentiment behind this poem is that England ought to be proud of having produced men who were strong enough, courageous enough, spirited enough, and devoted enough to the English tradition of liberty to go to war with their motherland. Be proud, he says to Mother Britain, be proud of those strong sons of thine who wrenched their rights from thee. But thou rejoice with liberal joy, that is, with joy that begrudges no one else his liberty. And this is something that's essential to this concept of Anglo-American liberty that Tennyson is building up and that I think we strive for in this country, that we're not here to democratize the world, but we're also not threatened by anybody else's liberty, right? This is this idea that he's trying to instill in his English readers as well as in his American readers. And this speaks to a very real attitude on the part of the American founders. And it's often been pointed out that what the founders were rebelling for was not the end of England or Englishness or the English Empire, was not anti what Britain stood for. What they claimed was their rights as Englishmen. They felt that they had been abused by the crown as in the tradition of like Magna Carta, right? In the tradition of this British idea that even though the king rules, he serves as a kind of representative of God at God's pleasure and as a representative of the nation, which itself exists in part, right, for the common good, for the good of all citizens, and that those citizens are by rights free men, and therefore there are limits to what the king can and can't do. Magna Carta famously binds the rights of the king to God, and so there is this authority, and this was very important for the colonists, as was this idea that they were Englishmen, damn it, and that's why they needed to become Americans, damn it. And this idea, which is very deeply rooted in the revolution, in fact, is in some sense the definition of the spirit, what we call the spirit of 76, is a great reason why, despite what the critics may say, despite what people on the right and the left now sometimes claim, our current bacchanalia of licentiousness, our current free-for-all of just everyone should be able to do everything all the time, is not a natural development of the American spirit, is not, whatever else it may be, is a corruption and not a natural development of what the founders had in mind when they rebelled. They were in favor of ordered liberty and were attempting to found a regime that they thought could best protect that. And this is why people like me get so passionate about that regime, about the Constitution, about the founding documents. It's not because I'm in love with a piece of paper. It's not because I think we should all live like we lived in 1776. It's not because I want to send us back to the evil 19th century. None of that. I believe in forward motion. I believe that things do develop, that times change. But I think that this idea of free men governing one another, ruling and being ruled in turn under the system established in the Constitution, is the best and brightest idea we've had yet in the West politically. I still believe that, despite it all. Say what you will, call me a boomer con, call me a squish, call me a lib, whatever. That's what I believe in, and that's why I'm celebrating on July 4th, because I genuinely think that that is still the best way to live. It may collapse and crumble into impossibility in my lifetime. I pray and hope it will not. I believe that there is such a thing as revival. I think you can recover this spirit, and I don't think we're as desperately far away from it as some critics might suggest. But I celebrate on July 4th, not because of anything that happens to be going on right now, not because I think everything is hunky-dory, it's obviously not, but because I think we are the carriers of the flame of Western political genius. And I think that's what Tennyson was saying. I think he believed that England could also rise up as the older brother in that partnership, as the mother, could recognize the rights, the lesson that it had taught, right? He says that Americans retaught the lesson thou hadst taught by wrenching their rights from thee. And this thing about Hampden at the end, the deep chord which Hampden smote, his last stanza, as I understand it, was not originally in the poem, and he picked it up out of a different poem and put it in here, but it actually works brilliantly. It works great because John Hampden was a major figure in the English Civil War, which was not terribly long before the American Revolutionary War. And actually, as I've said before on the show, that spirit of Protestant uprising and individual rights and even republicanism, those spirits which were very much animating the American Revolution were sort of prefigured in this Civil War, which pitted Parliament against the king and ended in a regicide. King Charles I was killed. But before all of that, as Parliament was beginning to assert its rights against the king, John Hampden was one of the major leaders. He was closely related to Cromwell, who became the central figure of the revolutionary effort. And Hampden, who died early in battle and so didn't live to see the death, the execution of Charles, was kind of a compromise figure. He was looked to as somebody that could broker peace between the various different factions of the parliamentary coalition, because much like our Revolutionary War and any uprising that is proposing to effect major change in a society. Within that uprising, you had various different factions, some of them more radical than others, some of them really just arguing that kings have no divine right, or, that kings really ought to be sort of subject entirely to the will of the people. And so, like, very much on kind of this American end of things. And some of them much more moderate and only objecting within certain strains. And so Hampden was somebody that could kind of bridge those gaps. And so the harmony that he's talking about here, he's saying, look, as the world gets bigger and as we have these conflicts between the growing American empire and the established English empire, we're going to broker various different kind of treaties and arrangements. Some of them might be unsatisfactory. But the single note from that deep chord which Hampden smote, that is this sort of liberal understanding of fellow feeling between manly, free parties, entities, and ultimately, in this case, nations, is the spirit that animates Tennyson's salute to America, and that he hopes will vibrate to the doom. And there is this darker side to this, that he's worried about the future, and yet he's saying, until the end of this journey that we are on, that's the spirit that we're aiming at. We're aiming at a common devotion, free but united, a common devotion to ordered liberty, which is a beautiful idea about not just the relationship between America and England, but about the project that we're both involved in, which is bigger than any one nation, which nations themselves are actually in service of this larger thing called ordered liberty, which is, in fact, the context within which human beings can flourish and grow toward God. And since everything is so glum right now in both countries, and since we're in this period where it feels like we're suffering from a kind of decrepitude and exhaustion, not just in the age of our politicians, but in the general vibe of worn out, tired ideas inadequate to face the moment. Because of that, what really gets people like me in our hearts and in our guts is the sense that that light, which took centuries to keep alight and which passed from England to America, it might be dimming or sputtering out altogether and might have reached the end of its natural life cycle. And if indeed this is a merely human endeavor, then it will have the end of its natural life cycle. And it will, if we think of this project as simply a political project instantiated by certain people at a certain time, then all human things will die. And this is true, I hate to say, even of America. I'm not saying, tomorrow we're going to erupt into civil war, God forbid, but I am saying that even this nation state of America will not live forever, will not be a country for like infinity time until the second coming or whatever. But if you're focused on this divine spark of liberty, this idea that has been growing and growing, and yes, has been embodied in particular nations and peoples and times and places, but nevertheless, I think, is actually bigger than all of it. Than all of those peoples, that we do live under that light. If you believe that, then it's extremely disheartening to think that there's nobody around that seems to want to live that way, or to be able to figure out how to live that way in the 21st century. And not myself being a politician, I can't here offer you a prescription. I mean, I have ideas about what would be good policy and how we might kind of turn this ship around politically, but I'm mostly just here to suggest to you that in this period of deflation for both England and America, as I survey the territory, ironically, and you may laugh at this, but America still looks to me like the place where that spirit might yet come back to life. And I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna here and say that it's going to. But if I look at this gridlock that England is in with its current election, its upcoming election, and I look at our upcoming election, I notice one thing that's different about us in America, and that is our uniquely American chaos. The utter hilarity and absurdity of our situation strikes me as, in some sense, a uniquely American kind of turmoil and ridiculousness that has been part of the frontier spirit of this country since forever. And by that I mean that, yeah, Trump and Biden both in their own ways kind of alarming figures. All that having been said, when you look at who Trump is and kind of the weird, almost clownish nature of his ringleadership, somewhere in there, somewhere in his bluster and his rhetorical overstatement and in what I have criticized as his genuinely irresponsible rhetoric at points in his presidency and in his post-presidency, somewhere in there, there's this idea that America ought to be great, and America ought to be the America as founded. And I don't think Trump is like the theorist who has the perfect idea of what that looks like, but I do think he has the instincts and the spirit. And looking more generally at what's going on with us, yeah, there's all kinds of problems, but I'm also sort of amazed at some of the stuff we've seen, like that the Supreme Court just overturned Chevron deference, which, much like Roe v. Wade, was kind of this set in stone ancient precedent because it was, 40 years old, and for Americans, that's ancient. And that's a genuine transformation of the way that our government is going to have to do business. It's going to cause a lot of problems, a lot of logistical chaos. It also is a turn in the direction of the country as founded, which, by the way, the constitution of this country, the idea of this regime, is not some perfectly oiled machine that's always supposed to run well. It comes with genuine trade-offs, genuine challenges. Things like freedom of speech, man, are really dangerous. And this is why I get so insane when people say, like, it's dangerous to talk, to just let people say whatever. I'm like, yes, it is dangerous. Like, as a nation, because we've chosen liberty, we've chosen danger, we've chosen risk. And similarly, self-government is dangerous. It's much more, I won't say effective, but at least kind of quiet. It's much more sleepy to be ruled by these elaborate interlocking systems of bureaucracy. It's much harder to figure out how Congress can write laws and the executive can enforce them, which is now going to have to happen without Chevron. But this is just one example of how, yeah, like the challenges we face are really, really huge. Many of the options on the table don't seem that exciting to me, but some of them seem vigorous and risky and vital and dangerous in exactly that American way. And I just want you to think, as you toast this country, which is not dead yet, as Monty Python said, on July 4th, I want you to think that we may yet reteach not just England, but the world, the lesson that we were taught by our mother country, which is the lesson of ordered liberty, and which, despite many, many years of taking a severe bruising of a really embattled and difficult couple of decades, as long as there's one people, maybe even many people, maybe even millions of people that want to live in a 21st century nation which embodies that ideal of ordered liberty, hope is not yet lost. Happy 4th of July. May your joy, not necessarily in what's going on, but your joy in the nature of this country as conceived and in the hope that we might yet steer our ship through these rocky waters, which uniquely belongs to us as Americans. May your joy be abounding and full, and may your barbecue be delicious. Let's do the mailbag. So mailbag questions come to me on Substack, which is where I write regularly every Friday, although perhaps not this Friday, because I might just be taking some time off. We'll have to see. But generally on Fridays, I write a newsletter at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I'm very, very grateful to all of you who have signed up over there. Please do subscribe to that newsletter if you haven't already. Once you are a subscriber, whether you want to be a paid subscriber or a free subscriber, you can DM me or email me with questions for the mailbag. And since I've been talking a little bit about politics this week, I thought I would answer a question about politics, and it's related to my essay about conservative art that I wrote at The American Mind. I will link to it here in this description. Emma wrote in with a question that I have heard from many different corners since I wrote that essay, and it effectively is, okay, you say conservatives want conservative art. You say they're not very good at knowing how to praise it or what it is or how to recognize good art full stop. But what do you mean, Spencer, by conservative art? Because I never define it in the essay. I just say this is something that people claim to want. But if you want to recognize any kind of art, conservative or otherwise, you need to cultivate taste and you need to understand how art works. And so Emma is now asking the hard question, which is, well, what do you mean by conservative art? And I've gotten this question from a lot of corners, and I will write, I think, a response to my various responses in which I address this more generally. But since it's here, let me lay out for you a few different things that I think people in general mean when they talk about art that is conservative. And then let me say to you what I think is most hopeful, or what I have the most hope for and interest in as a critic and as an observer of art. So one form of conservative art that I think people generally are least interested in is basically propaganda. And I'm actually a little bit more bullish on propaganda than most. When I say propaganda, what I mean is you write a story or you depict an idea or you paint a painting even that expresses directly, the thing that it expresses is a political idea. And so our archetypal version of propaganda would be the Uncle Sam poster, right? That military recruitment poster, Uncle Sam wants you. That is a statement about patriotism, that you have a duty to defend your country by taking up arms if you're a man. And yet it's expressed in language that is not purely verbal or propositional. And therefore it has a kind of mimetic quality to it, or a depiction quality, a representative quality, that Uncle Sam is this metaphor. And if you look at the original image, he's not the sort of smiley, goofy uncle that we typically think of, perhaps now. He's actually very stern and severe, and he has this sort of elderly patrician look to him. And he's conveying something extremely clear in his eyes. And that is an artistic gesture because it uses non-verbal, non-propositional modes of communication. It uses imagery and representation and metaphor to get across something that is subverbal or preverbal, that hits you deep in the gut, right? Now, propaganda gets a bad rap, and sometimes people say, oh, conservatives only want propaganda and that's why their art is bad. I actually don't think it's quite that way. I think that conservative propaganda is often bad because conservatives are often bad at art generally, which is this practice of conveying a range of things, including political ideas, via artistic means. And this is equally true on the left. Like if you look at the decline from Uncle Sam to, say, COVID posters, you will see that the art gets worse. And the ideas become, therefore, less stirring and powerful, even though, to some, they will nevertheless inspire a certain degree of whatever COVID posters are supposed to inspire. Fellow feeling, I guess, community spirit, right? We're going to get together and we're going to do activism and we're going to keep our masks on and all that stuff. But there are great works of art that are also political allegories that have explicit political ideas in mind. And though conservatives are often very ham-fisted in this, liberals are also often very ham-fisted in this because it's very easy with propaganda, with political allegory, to let the politics be the thing and the art be the window dressing. And that is not how good propaganda, good political art works. Good political art needs to get across an idea that can only be expressed, must urgently be expressed in an artistic way. And I'm thinking here of a movie like On the Waterfront, which is a great gangster movie that is also an allegory for what it was like to live through basically the Red Scare and to have to decide whether you're going to report your communist friends to the House Un-American Activities Committee. And there's an image, a feeling, a vibe, a sense that the makers of that movie could only encapsulate in that story. And so the story works on its own. It stands as a story, and then it comes carrying this explicit political implication. So that would be one version of conservative art. I do think there's such a thing as explicitly political art that works as art, and I think that conservatives could make it. But I'm not that interested in it because I don't actually think that's what people want or what they're reacting to when they lament the kind of universally leftist slant of so much pop art and so much general, consumer culture art. And part of that is because what we're actually reacting to when we look at leftist art is that it too is very ham-fisted and often very politics forward. And I'm thinking here of a show like The Acolyte, right? Or Star Trek Discovery, which has these extremely aggressive and kind of story extraneous political ideas that are clearly interfering with the obvious logic of the show. And things like the relationship between men and women is like aggressively topsy-turvy because the creators have this idea about the way the world is that they want to forcibly impose upon you by decorating it in this artistic fashion that, on top of everything, comes trailing these brand categories like Star Trek or Star Wars that you might have a personal attachment to, and that they're relying on that personal attachment to keep you watching so that you then will be more receptive to their stupid ideas, which you know are annoying, but this is how you end up with this set of videos or YouTube commentary online where it's like, The Acolyte is so terrible, here's my breakdown of every episode. And it's like, bruh, this is on you. Why are you watching this? And the answer is because people have this deep attachment to the brand and the lore, and I get that, and it's part of what was effective about the art in its original form, and now that's being hijacked as a kind of window dressing to this expressly political project, which is itself incapable of generating beauty or interest because it's sort of a dead letter as an idea. And so that's our criticism, those of us that want more quote-unquote conservative art. That's our criticism of leftist art. We're unlikely, I think, to revive the American artistic tradition by trying to do the same thing in reverse as conservatives, by just trying to make art that puts forward conservative ideas and then attaches artistic trappings or brand categories to them. We might get a little further because our ideas might be better, maybe, as conservatives, right? I mean, I think that some of our ideas, for example, about race and gender are at least better than what's on offer among the Star Trek Discovery left, among those that want representation of every possible obscure identity category. And so we might make slightly better propaganda down that road, but I don't think ultimately we would really be getting at what we're hankering for, which is actually just art, full stop, that doesn't begin from a political premise or idea, and yet nevertheless depicts the world as conservatives understand it really to be. And sometimes part of our problem, taste-wise, on the right as conservatives, is that we have too narrow an understanding of how the world is. We have a very clear idea about how the world should be, what ordered liberty would look like, and we have ideals that we want to kind of nudge people toward, like, for example, the nuclear family, right? And then we don't fully make space in our minds for the sheer variety of creation and also the delicate compromises that people make in a broken, fallen world and the realities that they're sometimes faced with. And the thing about really great art is that whether it has political ideas in it or not, it's unflinchingly honest about the fullness of what is encountered in the world. And so that's the conservatives' problem, is that sometimes we say we want art that depicts the real world, but what we really mean is we want art that only embodies our ideas about how the world should be. And instead, I think, what we ought to be saying is, look, as we understand it, the real world does include all this messiness and variety that the left is constantly harping on, but it also includes certain moral or even spiritual truths that will frame and indeed shape the consequences of various actions. And so, whereas you can show somebody, let's say, having a kid out of wedlock and making it through and demonstrating some valor but some moral complexity and some making some mistakes and doing some things right, and you can do all of that on screen very effectively, what you can't do is depict a world in which that's actually perfectly fine and it's just the same as getting married and having a kid within wedlock. And that's the dishonesty that we're reacting to. And it's not a dishonesty of what actually happens in the world. It's a dishonesty about how those choices that we make tend to unfold within a network of cause and effect. And this is one of my major complaints about multiverse stories, by the way, is that by destroying that network of cause and effect, it destroys a major pillar of reality as we experience it. And so a true conservative artist, I think, would take his conservatism not as the subject of what he's depicting, but as the backdrop or the framework, the grid against which his characters move. And then you can tell any story you want. And this is why, for me, the archetype that I keep coming back to is Macbeth, which is a story about a man that executes his benefactor out of sheer ambition, who's browbeaten into it by his wife, and who doesn't then burst into flame. There's no pit that opens up beneath him. But the moral reality of the universe, which is in part represented by this idea of this kind of shadowy idea of fate, ultimately draws him into this vortex of nihilism. And that's a realistic depiction of the price you pay for moral evil. There's a world that is the world that conservatives can recognize as they understand it, that nevertheless contains sex and violence and all sorts of bad characters and bad people and complicated individuals. And so I think what we're looking for is a way to make that kind of art in 2024 America. And I want to give a few other examples that don't all come from the modern era, but that might help us to think through this. One of them is a guy that I've talked about. I wish I had talked to him, but I've talked about him before on the show, and that's Fyodor Dostoevsky, whose political ideas, Dostoevsky is now claimed by conservatives often because he was so perceptive about the disasters that were going to unfold when the socialists took control of Russia. But his political ideas were not what we would now call American conservatism. He was not a fiscal conservative, for example. And he had an expansiveness of vision that included all sorts of very touchy-feely ideas about divine mercy that now, like, a lot of conservatives are kind of iffy about. And if you read, like, Brothers Karamazov, it's exceptionally squishy on questions of, like, salvation, for example. And yet, all of that having been said, Dostoevsky sees the world in its fullness, and that includes moral truths that conservatives know and respond to. And that's why we're able to recognize his art as, in some sense, quote unquote, conservative art, even if it's not art by a conservative or about conservatism. And another example that I would give here would be a novel that I'm currently reading, actually, which is Shogun. And there's a TV show adapted out of it that I haven't really seen, but this is like a historical fiction novel that, again, is not about like how we should all vote for Reagan or whatever, but it's about the world as men and women really operate within it in a way that it is now in places kind of shocking. And some conservatives will get shocked by the sex scenes in it, and lots of liberals have gotten shocked by the so-called white essentialism of it. But it's actually a very realistic depiction of an encounter between cultures, of the relationship between the sexes in a world that is on the brink of modernity, that still carries some of the sort of aroma of antiquity. Again, not a book that I would say, like, this is conservative art, but a book that takes reality seriously and that conservatives can get behind. And I think if we really want to, quote unquote, take back the culture as conservatives, we should be focused on not just making, but being able to appreciate and accept and honor art that is like that, and not getting all frumpy about how there's too many sex scenes and too many curses in there. Like, yeah, don't take your kid to an R-rated movie. Like, we all know that. Everybody accepts that, except for the crazy people that want, like, twerking babies or whatever. But that's not, in the context of this conversation, everybody that's having this discussion about conservative art knows that you should take care what you show your kids. But in the real world of adults making art, I think we ought to be not just making, but also seeking out and praising art that depicts the fullness of human reality within a framework of the moral universe as conservatives understand it. And that, by the way, should include God existing as a real entity, but not God swooping down in a chariot at the end of the story to rescue everybody, right? That's the difference that I'm talking about here. And learning to tell the difference and learning to be sophisticated about the kind of stuff that we are watching and appreciating and even celebrating or funding or endorsing or whatever has to do with learning how to appreciate art full stop within the context of the conservative worldview. That's what I have to say about that. I wish you all a very happy 4th of July. Please enjoy, wherever you are, a little time off. Don't despair. Drink a toast, if you will, to me and mine, and I'll drink a toast to you and yours on this 4th. If you like this show, please do share it. Please do spread it around. I always appreciate all of that. Any 5-star review you can give, any subscription if you've not already subscribed. In the notes to this show, you will find links to all the stuff that I've been talking about, plus some extra goodies. Do check those out. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.